Ann's got all of your money already. Please find yourself a seat. Welcome. I'll turn the microphone over to Ann Hill, our County Commissioner.
Good evening. My name is Ann Hill, and I'm the Clinton County Commissioner from District 6. I want to thank everybody very, very much for joining us tonight. I know that your time is very precious to you, and I appreciate the fact that you've chosen to spend the night here with us. Before introducing the speaker this evening, there are a few housekeeping items that we'd like to take care of. First of all, if you need to use the facilities, straight to the back, go out the door there, turn right. On the right-hand side, you're going to see some double doors. Go through those double doors, and both the men's and the women's are right there. Please help yourself to the beverages and the food in the back. And we will start, if we could, Phil, with the pledge. If you could lead us in the pledge.
You could all stand, please. Thank you. This isn't illegal yet, so that's a good thing. If we may. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And then Pastor J.C. Hall, KrisAnn's husband, is going to lead us in a prayer, please.
Let's pray. Father, thank you tonight for this opportunity to gather together, Lord, in this land of liberty that you have gifted us with. And we pray, God, that you would give us the wisdom and the strength to guard and steward and recover your gift of liberty. We pray, God, that you would give us understanding and enlightenment tonight. We know that this is not a political battle. It is a spiritual battle that's manifested in the political and civic realm. So, Lord, pray that you would give us wisdom to be able to understand the devices of the adversary, and God, that we may develop tools and strategies to counter, through your grace and your strength, his devices. We pray, Lord, that you'd be with us tonight. Open our hearts and our minds. Let us receive truth and go out and put it into practice. And Lord, let us stand on your promise that if you be for us, who can be against us? In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I'd like to take a moment to tell you why I asked her to come and speak to the group. In 2012, I was appointed to fill a vacancy as a Clinton County Commissioner, and I took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God, and firmly believed this with all of my heart. I ran and lost in the November 2012 election. In the spring of 2013, Sheriff Mack from Arizona came to speak in both Bath and St. John's on the topic of liberty, and I had the privilege to hear him speak. For anyone unfamiliar with Sheriff Mack, in 1993, when Congress enacted the Brady Act, Sheriff Mack refused to enforce it, stating that the federal government had no authority over county sheriffs. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Sheriff Mack won, with Justice Scalia finding that congressional action compelling state officers to execute federal laws is unconstitutional. During his visits to the area, he invited everyone to the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, or CSPOA, convention to be held in St. Charles, Missouri, that would be a few weeks from then. Having some free time available and fully impressed with what he had accomplished as well as his message, I opted to attend. This was a pivotal point for me. The convention was filled with sheriffs and peace officers who were putting their lives on the line and those of their staff every single day. Each of the speakers came to the microphone to speak about the challenges that they were facing while standing up for liberty in their jurisdictions, and the resulting personal consequences that they and their families had to endure. It was a truly humbling experience. One of the speakers that weekend was KrisAnn Hall, speaking on the genealogy of the Constitution. I found her to be one of the most riveting and compelling speakers there, and there were a lot of great speakers. However, at one point in the presentation, she asked the audience to answer a very simple question. which I hope she's going to ask all of you tonight. I'm embarrassed to say that I could not answer that question. And as I mentioned earlier, I had taken an oath to protect and defend our Constitution, so help me God. That weekend was a turning point for me. It was the beginning of my personal journey to educate myself on liberty, our Constitution, and the arguments our founders made, as well as the counter-arguments by the Anti-Federalists toward ratification of the Constitution. Having won the November 2014 election as Clinton County Commissioner, I am proud to say that I can answer the question now that she asked us that day. And when I took the oath of office in January of 2015, I had a very different understanding of what it meant to protect and defend the Constitution. Our speaker tonight is KrisAnn Hall. She comes to us from Florida, where she lives with her husband, Pastor J.C. Hall, and their adopted son, Colton. KrisAnn is an attorney and former prosecutor that travels the country educating on the Constitution and the history that gave us our founding documents. While working in the prosecutor's office, she began teaching her friends and family about the Constitution. And she did this in her free time. She was given the ultimatum by her boss, the prosecutor, to stop teaching or she would lose her job. KrisAnn refused to give up teaching and was promptly fired. She is a disabled Army veteran, Russian linguist, mother, pastor's wife, and patriot. She earned her bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Blackburn College and her JD from the University of Florida Levin College of Law. She is an author and has her own radio show, which can be heard at KrisAnnHall.com. She's taught on her Sovereign Duty Seminar to members of the state legislatures in the states of Ohio, Utah, Arizona, Kansas, and with the state of Washington just around the corner. Recently, she was asked to teach the officers of the Sheriff's Department in Eddy County, New Mexico, after some staff officers mistakenly followed the orders of IRS agents to seize property of one of the county's citizens without due process. So, without further ado, it gives me great honor to introduce to you a truly amazing patriot. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to KrisAnn Hall.
She should have warned me about that, and I didn't know she was going to do all that. I'm in the back of the room trying to compose myself so that I don't come up here bawling my eyes out. It is always so encouraging. I just want you to know how uplifting it is to my spirit to see people changed by the truth of this message. Because it really, really ought to do that. Sorry. Everybody ought to leave tonight different than they came, because there's so much that we have not been taught for so long. And even if you do have an understanding of the Constitution and where it came from, what it means, and what we're supposed to be doing, rarely do we ever see the richness of it. And it's so very, very important. Just a little clarification. My boss told me that I couldn't teach right-wing fringe groups. And he told me to teach that the Constitution believed in a limited government was an ethical conflict of interest for anybody who worked for the government. And those were the terms on which he said I could not teach. And I had practiced First Amendment law, and so I told him, I said, look, I'm not bothering my job. You've told me that I'm a top-notch prosecutor. I'm respected in my community. I wasn't talking about caseloads. I wasn't talking about you. I said, you can't make me be quiet on my own time, especially the supreme law of the land. I mean, we're the prosecuting office for the state of Florida. You would think we would be concerned about the Constitution, right? And so he said, I don't care. And I said, well, look, I am not going to trade my liberty for your paycheck. and I will not stop speaking. And he said, okay, you're fired. And what man meant for evil, God meant for good. Because this is what we've been doing ever since that day. I average about 265 teachings in 22 states every year now. We are on the road a minimum of 3 weeks at a time. I get to vacation in Florida at my house. So I'm home about 1 week out of every month, and now it's going to be even less because my husband, who was our pastor, has resigned as full-time pastor and joined a mission team to Haiti. And so when we're not on the road spreading the gospel of liberty to the people of the United States, we're going to be in Haiti spreading the gospel of Christ to Haitians. And we are very, very blessed and feel very honored to be a missionary family because we believe in what we're doing. How many of you think that this federal government is out of control? Well, the interesting thing is the state of our federal government didn't take our founders by surprise. They anticipated this. I'll remind you, the kind lady said to Mr. Franklin, "What kind of government did you give us, Mr. Franklin?" He said, "A republic, if you can keep it." You see, I have seen people, conservatives, write articles and books and talk about the framers and how the miracle of our Constitution and the amazing experiment. And I even saw one popular conservative claim that our framers were winging it when they wrote our Constitution. But you see, the interesting thing is they didn't wing it. They didn't make any of it up. There is nothing new, nothing novel in our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, or Bill of Rights. Every bit of everything within those documents was taken from over 700 years of their history. And we're going to learn that history tonight. Sometime you might think, KrisAnn, why are you just teaching us all this British history? After all, we're America, we're the melting pot, right? We're not all British. Well, that's true. But in 1776, and before that, everyone who lived in the colonies were subjects to the Crown of Great Britain, and the law of the land was British law. And our Constitution came from that. And so in order to know who we are, we have to know where we came from. All of this speculation on interpretations of the Constitution and interpretations of our rights, when you get right down to the brass tacks of it, when you understand the history of it, all of that interpretation is really unnecessary because the purpose of everything in the Constitution becomes crystal clear when you understand that the Constitution is not a statute book, but a document based on time-tested, blood-bought principles. John Adams said, "Liberty must be supported at all hazards." Notice he didn't say health care. But he didn't say prosperity either. He didn't say Social Security. He didn't say education. He didn't say your home. He said, "Liberty must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker." How many of you have heard of a principle called natural law? Ever heard of a guy named John Locke? Yeah. Well, John Locke is who our framers studied to understand these principles of natural law. And natural law teaches that we are created in the image of God. And because we're created in the image of God, we've inherited certain things from God. One thing that we've inherited from God is freedom. God is the most free being in the universe. Raise your hand if it's your job to wake up every day and tell God how to run things. I always see the men look at their wives, right? We tell you what to do, so we must be telling God what to do, right? No, we don't even get to do that. We are created in the image of God. We've inherited this freedom. But we don't want to live in a place where people are free. And that's not sarcasm. That's realism. Because if we live in a place where people are free, that means I'm free to lie, and I'm free to steal, and I'm free to murder. I am free to do whatever is right in my own mind, regardless of how that hurts you. Raise your hand if that's the place you want to live. Because you see, freedom all by itself is lawlessness. Liberty and freedom are not the same thing. Liberty is freedom plus morality. That shared morality that says, I recognize I am free to lie and I'm free to steal and I am free to murder, but I won't because it's wrong. How many of you recognize I'm free to murder my neighbor? Right? I am free to do that.
Yes.
I am free to murder my neighbor whenever I want to. I'll suffer the consequences of doing so, but I'm free to do that. And there are only two things that will stop me. I am free to murder my neighbor anytime I want to, but I will not because it's wrong. Morality. I am free to murder my neighbor anytime I want to, but I will not because he's well armed. Because the bottom line is something your legislators don't want you to know. Laws don't stop crimes. The criminal justice system was not designed to stop crimes. It was designed to identify criminal activity and set up a mechanism to punish criminals. If laws stopped crimes, we'd be a crime-free country because we got way too many laws. That's why morality is such an important part of liberty. Because liberty requires self-governance. And that's what our framers knew. You see, the genius of our framers was not declaring independence from Great Britain. The genius of our framers was that they declared independence from kings. And the only way they could come to the conclusion that they had to become independent from kings to be free and to have liberty was because they had 700 years of experience of doing the same thing over and over again and seeing the same results. John Adams said, liberty must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker. But if we had not, our fathers have bought and purchased it for us with their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. Because there's a long history that's brought us to this day. And with that history comes valuable experience. Patrick Henry said, I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that's the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past. How many of you realize history repeats? But those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. And before you leave here this evening, you will be convinced, if you are not already, that history always repeats. And you will be convinced that we are repeating the worst parts of it out of our ignorance. And the history of our Constitution actually begins in 1041. In 1041, the Anglo-Saxons are governing themselves because the Danish king had passed away and they resisted the Danes' rule over them. They were governing themselves in small communities. Now it was working really, really well for them, except for one thing. You have all these kingdoms on the outside looking in at the Anglo-Saxons and saying, oh, isn't that interesting? The Anglo-Saxons don't have a king. They must need one. And I'm the perfect man to do it. And so the Anglo-Saxons are constantly trying to fend off foreign kingdoms' attacks because the kings want to bring them into the kingdom. But they were having a problem within these small communities organizing themselves for their common defense. I mean, they didn't have Twitter and Facebook where they could just simply text each other over their phones and say, hey, the Danes are coming, let's all meet on the street corner. Not only that, in order to prevent an attack or to stop one, you have to negotiate, right? Peace negotiations. How many of you think that a king is going to openly negotiate with a common man? Not going to happen. negotiate for their peace or trade or anything. So they go to this man named Ethelred in 1014. Now, Ethelred's family had been kings over the Anglo-Saxons when they had kings prior to this point. And so they went to Ethelred and they said, "We will make you king on one condition. Your only job is foreign affairs. Your only job will be to organize us for our common defense and help us negotiate with foreign kingdoms for peace, for trade, commerce, that sort of thing. You will leave us alone to govern ourselves." Now, if we've been teaching the Constitution properly for the last 50, 60 years, light bulbs would be going off over everybody's head right now. Because that's the exact same agreement the states made when they created the federal government through the Constitution. Your only job, federal government, is foreign affairs. You will leave the states alone to govern themselves. Just so you know, I'm not making this up. James Madison, how many of you know that guy? Well, I'm sure you don't know him. I've heard of him, right? We call him what? The father of the Constitution, right? James Madison says in Federalist Papers 45, the powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined. We've made a box, few and defined. Those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. He says the powers delegated to the federal government through the Constitution are reserved to external objects. That's founders speak for foreign affairs. Now, he doesn't let us wait around for the Supreme Court to define what external objects are. He's actually going to tell us. He says such as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. And then he sort of punctuates that by saying, and the latter is what we will use to, the latter is the power by which we will collect taxes. You see, you're only supposed to be taxed by the federal government for war, peace, negotiation, or foreign commerce. And then he said, everything else, down to the minutest details, the lives, the properties, and the prosperities of the states are reserved to the states. They didn't make that up. That was the Ethelred Agreement of 1014. Interesting thing is, human nature always kicks in, right? You start calling somebody a king, don't be surprised when he starts acting like one. And when people start looking to government to be their provider, don't be surprised when they start acting like subjects. And so only going to pass about 30 years, and we're going to have a brand new king. His name is Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor is described by the Anglo-Saxons as a generous king. Now remember, the Anglo-Saxon agreement with Ethelred never gave the king the opportunity to be generous. He was not supposed to have that kind of impact on the people's lives, but they were happy now that the king was generous. But they had a problem, you know, because people like free stuff. Maybe he was giving out phones. Or promising to pay their mortgages or something, right? But you see, Edward's about to die. And he has no heir. Which means we now have to go to a list of people who are next in line for the throne, cousins and stuff. Now let me make this personal for just a second. Imagine yourself on that list. You are next. You are the next one in line to be king. Aren't you waiting for someone to die? Okay? Why? Because it's great to be king. You get whatever you want. And there's no difference here. The guy on the list, his name is William I. And he is ready to be king, so much so that he's already contacted the Anglo-Saxons. This is how we're going to do my coronation. This is how we're going to transfer the power. But there's a problem. Because the Anglo-Saxons do not want William to become king. Because William is not Anglo-Saxon. And the Anglo-Saxons do not want a foreign leader. Imagine that.
Yeah.
So they hatch out this plan to appoint a man named Harold. Harold has been Edward's right-hand man. They're pretty sure he's going to run the kingdom the same way Edward did, you know, the whole generous bit. But the year is 1066, and we're not appointing kings. And we're not electing them. Kings are born. It's called divine right. And the only way you get to be king is if you're born in the right family, in the right birth order. So even if you're a man born in the right family and you're the fourth born of 4 sons, you don't get to be king until you can knock off 3 brothers. I mean, you know it happens that way. Well, William catches wind that they're trying to pass him over as king, and he is not happy. This is where it becomes bad for the Anglo-Saxons. Because you see, William has a nickname. He's called William the Conqueror. What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? He conquers. He raises his Norman army. He goes over and defeats Harold and the English people and makes himself king. But now William's going to get the surprise because one of the main reasons the Anglo-Saxons didn't want William to be king is because he's Norman. And Norman kings operate completely differently than Anglo-Saxon kings. Remember, the Anglo-Saxon kings are limited in their power. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are literally called limited monarchies because the power of the king is limited by the people. Norman kings are completely unlimited. So when William finds out that these people expect him to rule in an Anglo-Saxon way instead of a Norman way, he is not happy. But he realizes something. He could issue a decree, because kings do that. They issue decrees that are legally binding on the people, and simply say, I am a Norman, and we will now rule in the Norman way. But he knows something, you see. He knows that when people don't like their kings, they don't start a recall petition. They don't find a new king to run against him in the next kingly election. When people don't like their kings, what do? Chop off their heads. William's fond of his head. And he realizes that if he steps up and issues a decree and changes their whole way of life, he has just conquered these people to become kings, so he's already not popular. And if he just wipes out their law like that, he is guaranteed a rebellion and quite likely going to lose his head. So instead, William thinks it better to simply fundamentally transform the kingdom in such a way that the people don't even recognize the transformation as it's happening. Now, the limiting factor on the king is common law. Common law says there are some things that are always right, some things that are always wrong, things the king can't change. And so in order to gain this unlimited Norman power, he's got to get rid of that common law. So the first thing that he does is he starts replacing the judges in the common law system with judges who are not loyal to the common law, but loyal to the ideology of the king. So now he's going to use those judges to enforce his foreign Norman law on the Anglo-Saxons, even when that law is contrary to their common law. He starts chasing the private landowners off of their land with threats and force, literally chasing some of them completely out of the kingdom. And you know what happens when their land becomes abandoned? Abandoned land automatically reverts to the ownership of the king. Oh, look at this abandoned land, William says, and starts inviting all his foreign friends to live in the kingdom with him. How else do you keep foreign law in a kingdom unless it's full of people who like that foreign law better than the common law of the land? He starts taking over the leadership of the churches. The churches are very, very powerful at this time. He starts replacing the leadership in the churches with men who are not loyal to the Word of God, but loyal to the ideology of the king, so he can use the churches to convince the people to do things even when those things are contrary to the Word of God. This transformation takes place over about 40 years, through the reign of William I and his son, William II. Now, William II is described as being a wicked, evil king, just like his father. Good news for the Anglo-Saxons, William II is only going to rule for about 13 years. Because one day, William II and his little brother, Henry I, are going to go hunting together. and William I is killed in a mysterious hunting accident. When a stray arrow from Henry's hunting party accidentally, mysteriously kills William, making Henry king. Raise your hand if you think this was an accident. But you see, how many of you heard of a guy named Solomon? Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun because human nature never changes. And the Anglo-Saxons weren't buying this whole accident story either. Which means now Henry has to do some things to appease the people. Even though they didn't like William. Murdering your brother to become king does not make you a popular king. Because if you'll kill your brother, then what are the people to you, right? So Henry has to do some things to appease the people. One of the very first thing Henry does is he comes to the people and says, "People, I realize the circumstances surrounding my brother's death seem a bit suspicious. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a tribunal. I'm going to select 3 men of great reputation who are going to investigate whether I'm at fault for the death of my brother or not." Maybe they called it a congressional hearing. And how's that going to work out when the government's investigating itself? Henry's not at fault for the death of his brother. But see, the people aren't buying this investigation either, so Henry has to keep trying. He does a few more things, but the most important thing Henry's going to do. Remember I told you 700 years to write our Constitution? Over those 700 years, there are 5 documents that had to be written. Our framers, when you read their writings, refer to them as liberty charters. I call them the genealogy of our Constitution. Because just like if someone went back in time and murdered my great-great-grandfather, I wouldn't be here, right? If somebody went back in time and eliminated one of these 5 documents, we wouldn't have a Declaration of Independence, a Constitution, or a Bill of Rights, and if we did, they would look totally different. Henry signs the very first of those documents. It's called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. The 1100 Charter of Liberties was Henry's promise that government would never be evil and oppressive again. How's that working out for us? Henry makes a list of 14 things that government can't do because once they do them, the people will know the government's being evil and oppressive. Just for example, Henry says, if any of my baron or earl shall die. Now the barons and the earls are property owners. He says, if any of my baron or earl shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. Henry's simply saying that if the heirs of an estate have to purchase their estate from the government before they can receive it, you have an evil and oppressive government. Isn't that what inheritance tax is? Estate tax? I mean, don't pay your inheritance tax, see how much you get. And then we might begin to figure out that property ownership in America is nothing but an illusion. You don't own your property. You can pay off your mortgage clear. You fail to pay your taxes for 3 years, and you'll see who owns your property, because the government's going to repossess their land and sell it out from underneath you. You want to see how ridiculous it is? Go read your newspaper when they publish the tax rolls and see how many people's lands are being sold for what. I live in a rural community. I looked one day. I saw 6 acres of land being sold for $250 in back taxes. 3-bedroom, 2-bath house on 9 acres sold for $1,200 in back taxes. Wouldn't you like to buy a piece of property like that? You know what the interesting thing is? The government's not buying it for that. They think they already own it. They're simply repossessing it because you have failed to pay your rent. And Henry said, that's an evil and oppressive government. And we allow them to call that revenue. Well, Henry is not interested in liberty. Henry is interested in keeping his head. But now the people have a promise in writing. A standard of government that says you can't be evil and oppressive. And they're going to need this standard in 100 years. Because they're going to have the most evil king they'll ever know. His name is John. John is a massive taxation king. And if you can't pay your taxes in John's kingdom, which is highly likely, you are arrested, mutilated. He is cutting off hands, feet, ears, cutting the tongues out of people who cannot afford to pay their taxes. They called him ruthless and vicious. One person even said even hell was fouled by the presence of John. That's a pretty bad dude. You guys know John, by the way. You probably don't realize it. How many heard of a guy named Robin Hood? Yeah. That's the king in the Robin Hood legends. How many of you realize that we are suffering from a disease called historical revisionism? Well, we not only revise facts, we also revise legends. Why is Robin Hood, why are we taught Robin Hood is famous? What are we taught that he did? Rob from the rich and give to the poor. Only that's not true. That's not what Robin Hood was doing. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich to give to the poor in an effort to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through oppressive and unlawful taxation and returning it to the people so they could live. John is literally executing people for not paying their taxes. Robin Hood's not trying to put everybody on equal financial footing. He's giving them their lives back. He is not a socialist. He's a liberty fighter. Because the first step to liberty is always a right to life. Because think about it, if you can't breathe, what do you get? Something we need to learn from history that's exemplified in John's reign. Murdering people for not paying their taxes is never enough to bring the people to point of revolution. You see, those evil and oppressive governments that Henry was trying to prevent understand that if you can keep your society of people focused on stuff, the stuff that they have, the stuff they think they can get, all you have to do is trickle down just enough stuff to make them happy subjects. But there's a good news in here, because you see, tyrannical governments always get power drunk. They start thinking they can do anything and the people will never push back. And then they commit some fundamental error. It's always different for everybody else. For John, his fundamental error was this. The people had chosen a man named Stephen Langton to be the head of their church. John doesn't like this guy because John wants a yes man, and Langton's not going to be that for him. So John steps up and says, I'm not going to let you choose who the head of your church is going to be. I'm going to pick the leadership of your church. But John has already forgotten about the 1100 Charter of Liberties. Because the very first promise Henry makes, it's not even in the list of 14, it's in the preamble, is that the church will be completely free from government intrusion. That's, by the way, where we get our principal separation of church and state. It was not because Thomas Jefferson invented it in a letter to the Danbury Baptists in 1802. Thomas Jefferson was simply remembering his history lesson because in 1100, Henry I said, if the government is in your church, you have an evil and oppressive government. But you see, a rebellion comes against John now, bringing us our second document in the genealogy of our Constitution. This one's called the Magna Carta. I'm pretty certain most of you heard of the Magna Carta. I'm also pretty certain of you that many of you, if you haven't already had this lesson that I'm teaching, have never heard of the 1100 Charter of Liberties. Because you see, if we have a constitutional program teaching today, if they bring you beyond 76, which is rare in and of itself, they stop at the Magna Carta. Which is interesting. Because number one, there is no Magna Carta without the 1100 Charter of Liberties. And number two, when you leave out the 1100 Charter of Liberties, you miss the biggest transition in the hearts and the minds and the souls of the people in the understanding of liberty. Pop quiz, are you ready? Who wrote the 1100 Charter of Liberties? Henry I, right? Charter of Liberties was a promise from the king. The Magna Carta is not a promise from the king. The Magna Carta is a demand from the people. The people saying, hey, you made us a promise in 1100 that governments would never be evil and oppressive anymore. You obviously have no idea how to keep that promise. So now we, the people, will rise in our majesty. We will place ourselves above the king and tell the king what he can and cannot do so we can make sure he keeps those promises. Creates a committee of 25 men called the Royal Council that will have the power and the authority to sit in the king's court and tell the king, no, you can't do that because it breaks your promise. Our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th amendments in our Bill of Rights come from clauses 38 through 40 in the Magna Carta. We did not invent them. We inherited them. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta gives us another really important aspect of our Bill of Rights. But before I tell you that, I'm going to give you that infamous pop quiz, which means you can't cheat. No pocket constitutions, no smartphones. And even though I want you, we have a good time in a responsive sort of workshop that we're having. This time, I don't want you to speak out loud. I don't even want you to whisper, mumble, or even lip sync the answer. Because it's important to know whether your neighbor knows the answer, not whether you do. And if you know this pop quiz, you're not allowed to answer at all. Cheating. The First Amendment is first on purpose, and with a purpose. On Saturdays, I teach a 5-hour workshop that goes through this history in greater detail, and then I walk through the Bill of Rights 1 through 10. I show you where they came from, what they mean, why they're there, how they're supposed to work, how we're doing it all wrong, and the solutions to making it right. And one of the most important aspects of this workshop is understanding that the First Amendment is first on purpose, with a purpose. And within the First Amendment are 5 liberties. To yourself, name all 5. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took a poll and found out that only 2% of the people polled could name all 5. Now, I don't know where you fall in that statistic, but I asked you that question so I could ask you this one. If you do not know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? Can we just set the record straight here? I'm going to be very clear, very blunt. There is not a single person in this room with constitutional rights. There is not a single person in our country with constitutional rights. Because the Constitution grants you nothing. Your rights do not come to you by the Constitution. Your rights come to you by God. They are inherent because you breathe. Guess what's great? You don't even have to believe in God to have these rights. And that's what inherent means. Not gifts of government, but possessions of men. The Constitution does not protect your rights either. How is that possible? The Constitution is a piece of paper with ink on it. The Constitution can't write your representative a letter. The Constitution cannot sit in your senator's office and demand compliance. Hey, Thomas Jefferson said the tree of liberty had to be fertilized with the blood of patriots and tyrants every 20 years. But thank God that's not happening here. But what if it happens? The Constitution can't pick up a sword for you. Because the truth of the matter is, the only defender of your rights is sitting in your seat. And if you don't know what they are, you know what that tells me? You're not exercising them. And if you're not exercising them, they are already gone. So here's your homework. We got to get used to exercising our rights again. And one of the easiest ways to do that is freedom of speech. Your homework for the next week and for the rest of your life, just do it for the next week and then the rest of your life will be easy. Every single day, position yourself in public to say something unpopular. Some of you have that one mastered, right?
Yes. It doesn't work with our spouse.
No. No, I always tell kids you don't have freedom of speech in your home, and husbands, don't try that at home with your wives. Just teasing. You see, the First Amendment is not there to protect popular speech. Popular speech needs no protection. But when you go and tell your friends and family members who haven't quite reached that level of awakening that you have, that they need to say something in public that's unpopular, you know, that's going to make them nervous. It makes them feel uncomfortable. Well, what if I say something that offends somebody? Woohoo! Then you're following the First Amendment. Because guess what? The First Amendment protects offensive speech.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court of the United States has even said hate speech is covered by the First Amendment. But you see, we've been so programmed and deprogrammed, that makes us uncomfortable. Let me give you something to think about. Exercising your rights is only uncomfortable to two classes of people: tyrants and slaves. We need to classify ourselves, perhaps. John signs the Magna Carta, which gives us Clause 61, the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of their grievances. The last aspect of the First Amendment: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom to assemble, the right to petition the government for a redress of your grievances. We didn't invent any of these things, we inherited them. John signs the Magna Carta with a sword at his throat, and the people are going to remove him from the throne less than a year later. Now they not only have a promise, they have the power to keep it. How many of you think kings being told what to do by people is going to go over well? Well, the Anglo-Saxons are now going to literally have to fight for the next 400 years to maintain that control. Because guess what? Since the beginning of time, the price of liberty has always been eternal vigilance. So we're going to fast forward. The year is now 1625. The king's name is Charles I. Charles is a handsome guy, a young guy, and he is described by the Anglo-Saxons as a massive spending king. He loves to romp about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. Now, I don't know if they played golf in 1625, but apparently we've been paying for vacations for a very long time. Whose money is Charles spending? People's. How is he collecting their money? Taxes. Charles has a problem, though, because that royal council created in 1215 is now called Parliament. And Parliament gets sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending, stands up to Charles and says to him, "We are not passing any more of your laws until you get your spending under control." Literally looks at the king and says, "We're going to defund you until you get a proper budget." Novel idea, right? Charles says, "Okay, fine, but wait a minute. I'm king. Why do I even need a parliament?" And he dissolves Parliament. Now, he didn't have to call in the sergeant at arms to have them removed, right? He could have just simply said, where Parliament refuses to legislate, I'll just go ahead and regulate. Or perhaps he held a State of the Kingdom address and said, if Parliament will not pass laws, I will. After all, I have a quill and a messenger. Isn't that the same as declaring, dissolving Parliament by declaring them irrelevant and powerless? And here's the key. If they act like it, then they really are, aren't they? Charles has got a problem, though. He's learning, right? You get too tyrannical too fast, they'll put a sword to your throat. He wants to keep collecting their money, but he can't pass a tax. So he comes to the people and he says, look, I'm going to collect your money, but don't worry, it's not a tax. Because you see, this decree I'm issuing to collect your money, I'm going to call it a forced loan. It's not a tax, it's a forced loan. 5 knights stand up to Charles and say, tax, mandate, we don't care what you call this. This is a violation of our liberty charters. We will not collect your tax, we will not enforce your law, and we're not even going to pay it. That's why you need a constitutional sheriff, by the way. That's precisely why the CSPOA is necessary everywhere, because you see, your sheriff has that power. Your sheriff has the power greater than the federal government in your county. Your sheriff is more powerful than your county commissioners, more powerful than your city council, than your state and the feds alone, because he is not a hireling. He is an elected representative. And even the Supreme Court says the federal government can't force your sheriff to enforce federal laws. Your sheriff has the right to say, no, we won't do that here. And I will tell you, he has the duty to, because of the oath that he took to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. If you have a constitutional sheriff, you don't care about the BLM, you don't care about the EPA, you don't care about the FDA, you don't care about any of these agencies that are unconstitutionally established, because your sheriff will tell them, no, not in my jurisdiction. But you see, Charles is going to throw these 5 knights in prison and deny them their due process. And a revolution is going to form. Bringing us the 3rd document in the genealogy. This one's called the Petition of Right of 1628. This Petition of Right of 1628 is an expression of Clause 61 in the Magna Carta. Oh, hello. Did we lose power? Well, there we go. It's back on. Oh, I'm not moving enough. Sustainable development. All right. This Petition of Right is an amazing document. It's an exercise of Clause 61 in the Magna Carta, list of grievances against the king. But it makes a declaration. Liberty is the inherent possession of men and not the gifts of government. Something that we knew in 1628 has just completely flown out of our minds today, if you listen to Chris Cuomo. Well, Charles signs the Petition of Right the same way John did, with a sword at his throat. But the people are not going to remove Charles the way they did John. Maybe they thought Charles learned his lesson. What do you think? Charles did learn a lesson. He learned that if I'm going to spend the people's money, I can't whim and fancy it. I've got to give them a good excuse. Good news is, the years between 1628 and 1641 provide Charles with that perfect excuse. See, it's very violent times in Europe. There are wars everywhere. And Charles comes to his people and says, hey, you see that over there? Let me ask you, do you want those wars that our friends are fighting to come to our kingdom? Do you? Of course you don't. Nobody wants war to come to our kingdom. I have really great news. You see, I have the perfect plan to keep those wars from ever coming here. It's perfect because it's very easy for you, very simple. You don't have to do much of anything. You see, all you have to do is give me your tax dollars. And I will make sure our allies are adequately funded in their battles. And if they're adequately funded, they'll be superior in power and superior in strength. They will win those battles over there. And if they win those battles over there, those wars will end over there, and they will never come here. See, I told you it was perfect. And simple. It's just a matter of national security that you pay your taxes. But the people are watching Charles very closely. And they're noticing something. Charles is not funding their allies. Charles is funding their enemies. Because he's made a deal with the enemies. I'll help you win over there. You come over here and help me get my people back under subjection. Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. A process which brings us the 4th document, called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. The Grand Remonstrance of 1641 reads, "The root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design, subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom." So what does that mean in modern English? just simply means we've been watching tyrants and oppressive governments now for about 600 years, and we're noticing a pattern. The same bag of tricks over and over and over again. And when you read the Grand Remonstrance, you see that pattern. Corruption of the court system. Infiltration of foreign law. The government diminishing the property rights of the people. The government taking control of the church. The government creating fiat money to control the monetary system. And the government disarming the people while they remained armed. Now I'm guessing you guys have heard of Agenda 21, right? You'd be interested to know that the United Nations did not invent Agenda 21. You know of Agenda 21, then you know the term sustainable development. Go read the Grand Remonstrance and you will see that Charles I was engaging in sustainable development. The people were complaining that Charles was taking the private land from the landowners in the name of resource preservation, and I quote, depopulation. They also said Charles was attempting to take them off the gold and silver standard by creating brass fiat money, and in 1641 they called that treason and chopped off his head. Now, before you get too excited, only 40 years will pass before we're back at it again. This time, the king's name is James II. And James II comes to the people because he's learned, right? I can engage in this malignant and pernicious design all I want as long as I can give the people things to distract them from what I'm doing. And I'm going to issue a decree so huge the people will never think I'm wrong about anything. He comes to the people, I'm going to give you something you've never had before. I'm going to give you religious liberty. He issues a decree that says you no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, anytime you want, with any pastor you want, on one condition. Before you have church, you must inform the king where you'll be meeting, when you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said. And you must promise that you will never ever say anything bad about the king in church. That doesn't sound like religious liberty to me. That sounds like a 501c3. So what's the difference between 2015 and 1688? In 1688, the bishops stood up against the king. 7 of them said, we don't care what you say. We have a promise over 500 years old that says you will stay out of our church. James throws these 7 bishops in prison, charges them with a crime called seditious libel. Seditious libel was that point of the decree that says you can't talk bad about the king. Now, James has learned from his predecessors that if you deny due process, they're going to chop off your head. So he's going to make sure these 7 bishops get their day in court. But he has nothing to fear because the crime of seditious libel is written in such a way that truth is no defense. So even if you're correct when you say bad things about the king, you still have to die. 7 bishops got their day in court. 2 of them were acquitted because they had judges who refused to enforce an unconstitutional decree. The other 5 were also acquitted because they had a jury of their peers who refused to find them guilty of an unconstitutional law. See, we did not invent our right to a trial by jury. And we did not invent our right and essential check and balance in jury nullification. We inherited them. A revolution comes against James, bringing us the 5th document. This one's called, the revolution is called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. They called it the Glorious Revolution of 1688 because hardly a shot was fired. James got so worried he was going to end up like Charles. By losing his head, he got on his horse and ran away. But from that, we get the 5th document called the English Bill of Rights of 1689. It read, whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of our kingdom. Now I had to look up that word extirpate. I didn't know what it meant, but it means to completely destroy. And so what they're saying is what James is doing is completely destroying liberty. How many of you have seen history repeat already? How many of you see the dots falling into place where every piece of our Constitution, our Declaration, our Bill of Rights comes from? We did not invent this, we inherited it. And this is not going to be any different with the English Bill of Rights. If you go read that document, so much of it is going to be familiar to you. You're not going to be able to believe it. I'm just going to pick one for you. They said James was completely destroying liberty by writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law when that was a power reserved to Parliament alone. We did not invent separation of powers. In 1688, they had separation of powers. They had a legislative branch and Parliament, an executive branch and a king, and a judicial branch. Separation of powers says powers cannot be shared with the branches and they cannot be stolen. And in 1688, they said when the executive branch is writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, when that is a power reserved to the legislative branch alone, the only result is the complete destruction of liberty. How is it that a people in 1688 who had no internet, no PBS, no History Channel, no CNN, no MSNBC, no Fox knew that executive orders were the complete destruction of liberty? And today our Parliament, Congress, our people, do nothing at all. The interesting thing about this is now when you see all this history, you realize that George III was not doing anything new. See, we eliminate all this history from our history books and we think that our framers came across this king named George III who was being this tyrant and they had to figure out what to do and what was going on wrong. They didn't have to because George III was simply engaging in the malignant and pernicious design. You see, we didn't throw tea in the harbor over a 3% sales tax. And we certainly did not go to war with our own government over taxes. By the time we signed the Declaration of Independence, by the time the tea went in the harbor, the sales tax on tea had been reduced already to 1.5%, and many of the taxes had been repealed. Can't be about taxes. It's got to be about liberty. See, the British government had gone into debt, defending the colonies in the French and Indian War, and then tried to recoup that debt from the colonists alone, instead of spreading the debt throughout the kingdom like they were supposed to. And this was a culmination of just the straw that broke the camel's back for our colonists, because you see, Parliament was refusing to allow the colonists to elect a representative to send to Parliament. And so the colonists started standing up and pushing back and saying, hey, these laws, not these taxes, these laws that you keep passing on us are being done without our representation. We are guaranteed that by the rights of Englishmen. Parliament said, don't be ridiculous. Of course you're represented in Parliament. We have people who have volunteered to represent your interests. The colonists said, seriously? They said, look, if they're over there on the island creating laws to be enforced over here on our continent, and they never have to come over here and live under the laws they create, they can't represent us. That's a little lesson we should be learning. That when the people who make the laws exempt themselves from the enforcement of those laws, those people cannot represent you, they only represent their own interests. And that is legislation without representation. Now, Parliament did not hear any of the cries of the colonists because they had no representation, so they started imposing consumption taxes on the colonists to collect this debt, a sales tax. But they were going to make sure they recouped this debt, so they charged the sales tax on the things that the colonists had to have: linen, lumber, sugar, tea, paper, and ink. And then got this brilliant idea. We can maximize our revenue for the collection of these taxes by mandating that the colonists purchase the taxed items. And if they refuse, we will throw them in jail. Now, in order to force these laws, Parliament passed a law called Writs of Assistance, which allowed the customs agents and the tax collectors to search and seize without warrants. Because we didn't invent the Fourth Amendment. We inherited it. And once you were found without the proper tax stamp on your items, linen, lumber, sugar, tea, paper, and ink, you were thrown into jail and transported to Quebec to be tried. Now, Quebec was a British colony at the time, but it was a unique British colony because Quebec was able to petition the British government to keep French law within their borders. So why did they choose Quebec? Because French law doesn't give you a right to a trial by jury of your peers. It was not about taxes. It was the East India Trading Company tea that went in the harbor on purpose because it was the East India Trading Company tea that was the government-mandated tea. By the way, it wasn't looting either. I don't know if you remember this from your history lesson, but John Hancock and several of the other colonists actually paid back the East India Trading Company for all the loss of their product. They were making a statement to the government that we have always governed ourselves and we mean to continue to do so. We did not go to war over taxes. We went to war over legislation without representation, mandated purchases, warrantless searches, denial of due process, and foreign courts and foreign law. So when it came time to stand up to George, they didn't have to figure out what to do. We wrote the Declaration of Independence, which technically speaking is the 6th Liberty Charter because it's based on British law, based on the Clause 61 in the Magna Carta about how George III was denying them their rights of the English Bill of Rights, the Grand Remonstrance, the Petition of Right, the Magna Carta, and the 1100 Charter of Liberties. They didn't invent anything except they sat down and thought, 700 years, we've been doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And we have discovered that negotiating with a king only lasts as long as you keep the sword at his throat. And the minute the sword goes down, kings go back to being kings and people going back to be subjects. So we're not just going to declare independence from Great Britain. We're going to declare independence from kings. How many of you remember from your history lesson that people were begging George Washington to be king? We need to thank God he was a moral and principled man enough to say, no, this is not what we want. And they created a constitutional republic. A kingdom is where the king holds all the power and hands out the privileges to the people as he sees fit. And if he's handing out the privileges, what can he do? Take them away. You live in a kingdom, you literally wake up every day wondering what's right and what's wrong. But a constitutional republic is where the people hold all the rights, as pointed out in the 9th Amendment, and delegate power to the government as they see fit, as pointed out by the 10th Amendment. Remember, Jefferson said that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. And when any government operates contrary to those means, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish them. Why? Because we hold all the power. Because we hold all the rights. By the way, they did not make us a democracy. And there is a really big difference between a democracy and a republic. Interestingly enough, there's really no difference between a democracy and a kingdom. The only real difference between a democracy and a kingdom is how many people rule over you. Because democracy is mob rule. Democracy means the majority holds all the power, and they hand out the privileges to the minority as they see fit. Which means if you live in a democracy, you have nothing if you're a part of the minority unless the majority says so. And that can change from day to day. We're not a democracy. If we'd been a democracy, Rosa Parks would still be in the back of the bus. Because only in a constitutional republic can a minority have a society-changing voice, and our framers knew that. Our framers knew democracies do not ensure liberty. Democracies only ensure tyrants and slaves. And what we say really matters. Because if we keep repeating that democracy lie long enough, it will become our truth. And we don't want that. It matters. History matters. Don't you think it's about time we start learning from history and stop repeating these mistakes? Don't you think it's about time we learn from the men and the women who lived this history instead of allowing the Supreme Court to pool its ignorance and tell us what they can and cannot do? How many of you are tired of having an unconstitutional government? Then we have to stop being an unconstitutionally minded people. We are not a reflection of our government. The government is a reflection of its people. You want to have a constitutional government, then you have to elect people that are constitutionally minded. Not just people who run their mouths. We got plenty of people running their mouths. People who are really principled. I call them liberty first principles. Liberty over security, principle over party, and truth over your favorite personality. I stirred the pot a little bit a few days ago. I got a little upset at Trey Gowdy, who went on Hugh Hewitt's radio show and said, "Oh, we just don't have any power to do anything against Hillary Clinton. We can't subpoena her server, so there's not anything we can do." And my head blew up. And I wrote a letter to Trey Gowdy. You can catch it on the internet. Go to my Facebook page, or it's on Western Journalism. Picked it up too. When our congressmen think they have no power against the executive branch, we are no longer a republic, we are a kingdom. And it's about time we start electing people who know the difference. What do you think? How many of you realize we are not teaching this in our schools?
Yeah, I know.
Which is why I have these two books. These two books contain the history that I just taught you. The purple book is for middle school, high school students. The blue book is for younger students. They're based on the same manuscript. The purple book is the full manuscript. And not only that, not only do the kids like to read it, but also, for the parents, it has study questions at the end of every chapter to help them continue their education. The little kids' book is colorful with pictures, and every chapter has a poem in it that acts like a memory verse. So your non-reader is not reading this book, but they can memorize the poem. They've learned what they need to learn in the chapter. Because we are dooming our children to repeat these mistakes because we're refusing to teach them the truth. And your Common Core education is going to teach them that our founders were nothing but a bunch of rich white guys who wanted to avoid paying their taxes. So they got together one day and accidentally created America. And we need to fix that. Remember, I told you that our framers what's happening today, it did not take our framers by surprise, right? They designed a solution for us. Would you like to know that solution? Well, I teach it in the 5-hour workshop that I teach. This is a 3 DVD set of that 5-hour workshop. And you can take that home with you today. There's almost 6 hours of training in here. Every section is chaptered at about 40 minutes, so you don't have to watch the whole thing all at one time. And where this leaves off, my newest book picks up. Every city councilman, every county commissioner, every sheriff, and every state legislator needs to have this book. This is not an opinion-based book. This is a fact and history-based book. It gives you that design solution that a framers put in our hand for when the government went crazy. Because Washington, D.C. is not going to fix itself, right? And if we think changing out the person in the White House is going to fix our problems, we don't know what our problems are. This book, just to show you, the last part of this book is nothing but citations. Every quote, every document that I use in this book is cited back to its original source text. because that's the only way you can know if I'm telling you the truth. And I don't want you to believe everything that I say. I don't simply want you to go out and repeat what I say. I want you to be a proponent of liberty, not a parrot. We need real boots on the ground. This book, Constitutional Activism 101. Remember I told you, using your First Amendment, getting the practice of it? Here you go. This is your handbook on how to use your First Amendment to begin to become liberty first minded and active again. We have all of these books available on our website as well, but we have some back there in the back for you to purchase. Today, if you purchase these two books, the DVD set, we ask $30. The book, Sovereign Duty, we ask $15, but if you purchase them together, because they really are one continuing thought, we offer this to you for $40. And then one of everything on the table is $70. How many of you can at least think of at least 3 people who should have been sitting next to you today? Well, let me tell you how you can fix that. How many of you would be interested in my 5-hour workshop? There's a catch. You have to invite me to come. We don't charge any speaking fees. We don't make any group pay us for our travel or our accommodations. We are not a fame ministry. We are a faith ministry. That's why God has given us the talents, I believe, to make and produce these books and these videos to help fund what we're doing. And He lays it on the hearts of people to help us, like missionaries, to donate and help us. And that's how we go everywhere. See, I want to come to all your groups. I want to teach your middle school, high school students. I want to teach your colleges. I want to teach your sheriff. My sheriff's educational course is 3 hours, and it's been improved in the state of Texas for continuing educational credits for your law enforcement officers. I want to teach your legislators. And I don't want there to be any excuses. Oh, we can't afford to have KrisAnn Hall. Guess what? It's not going to cost you a dime. But what's it going to cost our children for us to remain ignorant? Because that's who's paying for what we're doing. If you're under the age of 25, stand up right now. Do you see all these young people in here? This is the future of liberty, and this is who we have to reach. And I want you to know that we are reaching these people. Because you see, all the time people come to me and say, KrisAnn, well, it's really good that you're preaching to the choir, but we got to get to the young people. I'm going to tell you what, we're getting to the young people. We just came from Washington and Oregon. We taught 2 weeks in those 2 states. And in every single meeting, over a third of the attendants were under the age of 25. We are reaching these young people, and that's important because we have neglected their liberty. And they're going to pay for our negligence. My favorite founding mother said this: we will stand against tyranny today, or our children will bow tomorrow. But if you don't know what liberty is, if you can't define liberty, you can't defend it. And if you can't define tyranny, you cannot defeat it. We need to get educated. And then we need to get active. We need to stand, step up, and say, we will not comply anymore. I didn't come here to teach you. I came here to recruit you. Please don't leave the same way you came. Promise that you'll go to our website within the next 24 hours. If you don't go in the next 24 hours, you won't go. Listen to a podcast, read an article, hook up with me with Facebook, on Twitter, watch a video, and then share them. Be the Liberty First Brigade, boots on the ground, and let's restore our republic. What do you think? I want to thank you for having an open heart and an open mind and accepting the Liberty Call. I want to thank you for leaving changed from that CSPO. I want to thank you for going, because you're not a sheriff. right? But you found out that it wasn't just sheriffs there, right? Everybody has this obligation, and anybody who takes an oath needs to be there. And I want to thank you for doing that. I want to thank you for bringing me here. From my husband, my son, we appreciate the opportunity to teach. Everybody say hi to my husband. Now I want to ask you to please pray for us. It's not easy living on the road all the time. We are not independently wealthy, and we don't have a grant from the Koch brothers. But we have a Father who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and He takes very, very good care of us. But we need your prayers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We still have some food in the back there. I would like to thank a few folks. Rod, thank you for the sound system, for the Citizens for Liberty for providing information on Prop 1. In case you didn't get a chance to get the information when you were coming in, please stop by to get some more information from them. I'm sure they'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you for the video. I appreciate that. Steve and Sherry, you know, everybody, I appreciate everybody's help in putting this together. It's been fantastic. Well, please take I guess then, have a good evening. We'll try to see if we can get KrisAnn to come back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have not yet filled out informational cards,